As someone who's interviewed at various medical schools, both MD and DO throughout the country, as well as interviewed pre-meds for medical school, here are a few tips for making sure you do well on your medical school interviews so you can increase the chance that you get into the med school that you've always dreamed of. First, there's actually a lot of things that you can do before the interview even starts to make sure you're prepared to do well on your interviews. So the first thing to make sure you do is to review your AMCA's application pretty thoroughly, or your AACOMA's application if you're going to a DO school interview. Make sure you know your personal statement very well, your whole mission, your work and employment experiences, your extracurricular activities, things like your lapses in your grades, for example, and just know your whole application and both your primary and secondary applications thoroughly, all those responses that you carefully crafted in your secondary applications. So some schools have an open application interview where the interviewers will have read your application beforehand, and it's good to make sure you can account for or explain everything that is in your application in case an interviewer brings it up. Even if the interview is closed, where the interviewer hasn't seen your application before, looking at your AMCA's application is still beneficial, so you can show instead of tell different qualities that you develop, different skills that you have, instead of just explaining things and making a weaker case. So really make sure you know your story, what things shape your development as a future physician, and what really shaped your passion for pursuing medicine and the different things that you went through that shaped that drive and desire and crafted you into the person that you are today. Next, it's important to make sure you prep common interview questions. So these are things like your greatest strengths, your weaknesses, why medicine, what are the biggest challenges that you face, what are the biggest healthcare issues in medicine right now or other current affair issues related to healthcare, why medicine and not some other field like nursing or a research position like a PhD, why that school in particular instead of another school, and what makes you unique as opposed to the thousands of other medical students that pass through those interview doors. Also more casual questions like what do you do for fun, kind of paint you as a more holistic and well-rounded person instead of just a person that just studies and does stereotypical medical related stuff. And these are important for both traditional and MMI interviews, as I'll be talking about later. Next, you want to make sure that you've researched ethics questions and situations thoroughly. I would say the gold standard for this, if you had to only pick one resource, and I'll link all the resources down below in the description box as usual, would be the University of Washington bioethics page. It has a great website that covers plenty of things like the foundational pillars of bioethics and various cases for all kinds of situations that you can imagine. So I'd highly recommend reading through those background pillars and also looking through all those cases, and you'll definitely be well prepared for any ethics question that comes up. However, it's also beneficial if you have your own experiences working with communities like underserved communities to bring up those experiences if the ethics question kind of warrants that. If you don't have a lot of experience with different communities besides your own, you could read books like The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which talks about issues that where various African American communities faced and how they've led up to the culture that a lot of African American communities have towards physicians nowadays. Another great book is The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, which talks about different issues that the Hmong community has faced. And I'm sure there are other books as well, but those are two good books. There are other books, of course, that you can probably Google out there. And definitely take advantage of the University of Washington bioethics page. So next, make sure you have a good grasp of the current state of healthcare. So one book that I highly recommend is The Healing of America by T.R. Reid. He talks about the different healthcare systems throughout the world. And although it's a few years old, so it's not going to be current on every issue out there right now, it's still a good primer for the different types of healthcare systems that you can weave into your interview, especially if the interviewer asks a question kind of about the current healthcare climate or the different healthcare climates around the world. I would recommend the Healthcare Triage YouTube channel, which talks about healthcare as well as other kind of issues in medicine and new discoveries and advances, which brings me to the next point. Make sure you have a good grasp of new science and technological advances. So I recommend reading through things like the subreddits, R Science, R Technology, and R Medicine. There are other ones as well that you can look through for science news. If you prefer other websites, I would recommend websites like Science Daily, and there are lots and lots of them out there, as well as other YouTube channels that you can look at for news and information to stay on top of scientific and medical advances. So one, you're becoming a more informed and educated person about healthcare and medicine and science and where healthcare is going to go and medicine is going to go, but also so you can show interviewers that you are an educated individual who is on top of science and healthcare and is actually interested in the field. Next, make sure you know the school really well. Before med school interviews, for each school, I would make a document with different information that I found on their website. So things like their mission statement, their background, special programs that they offer, how their curriculum is structured, different things like that. And this ties in to one, knowing the school well, so you can target your interview a little bit more towards that school and appeal to that school more when you interview with individuals from that school. And also, it's important so you can come up with different questions, and I'll include a link to various questions down below as well that you can ask different schools. But asking targeted questions to interviewers about the school really shows that you care about the school, that you see yourself in the school, and shows that you're more of a serious candidate that sees themselves in a position where they'd be at the school. Next, you can look up previous experiences from different medical interviewers. There's links to, down below, allopathic and osteopathic interview reviews from different medical students on a student doctor network. There are also different forum threads that you can look up on your own, but there's a nice little database on SDN that has different schools that you can search up by school, and you can look up, sometimes there are questions that were asked to applicants and how they felt about the overall interview and the vibes of the school and things, other information related to the overall interview process. So that was really helpful to me. Again, check down below for that link. So make sure you practice a lot of the common interview questions. Don't memorize the answers, because I've interviewed students like that who've just kind of have memorized responses, and you just come off as really robotic and not someone that can fluidly and naturally have a conversation about themselves. It's also a problem when you're asked a question that you haven't memorized, and all your responses sound robotic, but when that question comes up, you start stuttering and you're really thrown off. So don't memorize, but just kind of have an idea of what you want to say and maybe plan something out, and just get the bullet points memorized in your head where you can just kind of expand on it naturally depending on the situation. It's good to have different anecdotes ready for different qualities that you possess, almost like an anecdote bank that you have, or a toolbox that you have. So if someone when's an experience that you demonstrated teamwork, you can reach into that little anecdote toolbox and pick out an experience where you were the president of like a science club and you organized certain events, and that shows more in a more persuasive way how you actually demonstrated teamwork as opposed to just saying you're a team player. So along with preparation, it's important to practice your responses, practice both traditional style and MMI style interviews. I was fortunate enough where my school had different opportunities to try out both of these interviews, and I had different clubs that offered MMI and traditional style interviews for practice. And you can check with your school or different pre-med clubs or science-based clubs that might offer those as well. Or you can just try to go through some of these with your friends. Next, before the interview, you want to make sure you arrange for accommodations. So if you're trying to stay with the host, try to arrange for that early on. Make sure you pick out your clothing. Make sure like your jackets and suits and your watches, all those key pieces that you're going to have, make sure they fit you well. You might have gained weight with all that pre-med studying and maybe your suit doesn't fit you well. But make sure you have access to transportation from your accommodation to the interview site. And you want to make sure you have other things like your contacts or maybe a spare pair of glasses in case your contacts mess up. A notepad is very helpful, I felt, during the interview to write down notes and maybe keep some questions that I could ask interviewers. And maybe thank you cards if you want to give the thank you cards right after the interview to the front desk maybe. And maybe a gift for your host if they are hosting you. Usually they're hosting you for free, so you're going to be taking up a lot of their time and space, especially if they're like a busy medical student or a resident. And so it's just a nice gesture to not only be kind to them once you're there, but also to give them a gift to show them your appreciation. So next, the interview types. You're gonna have traditional or MMI interviews. For traditional interviews, it might be you with 2 interviewers, 3 interviewers, maybe just 1 interviewer. It could be a panel or an individual, so it really varies. It could even be you and someone else or another 2 or 3 people with interviewer or a panel. I've had both. Usually they tend to be one-on-one, but sometimes they're one-on-two, you and 2 interviewers. I've had one instance where it was a group interview with me and a couple people and 2 interviewers. The interviewers tend to be faculty members. They can also be medical students. I think once it was a pharmacy student who interviewed me. It could also be just general clinicians and other community members. As I mentioned, there are open or closed applications. Regardless of whether they're open or closed, I think you should look over your applications so you have again anecdotes to draw from. You know your story well, and you're always ready to answer any questions that may come up, whether it is an open or a closed interview. I've actually had closed interviews where the interviewer actually asked questions about the person's AMCAS application. So you still need to know your AMCAS application or your ACOMAS application if you're applying to DIA school. thoroughly. So these interviews can range from like 30 minutes to an hour, maybe even longer, depends on how the system's set up. For these, you really need to make sure that you've prepared all the traditional interview questions. I've listed down below a lot of resources that cover different interview questions, both traditional and MMI style. So things like, tell me about yourself, I would recommend keeping it short. It's not going to be your whole AMCAS application regurgitated in 5 minutes as fast as you can. It's going to be something that's short and to the point, that paints a picture of why you want to do medicine and maybe key things that kind of drove you to medicine. Again, make sure you know things like your greatest strengths, your weaknesses, and have good answers kind of ready but not memorized to talk about all these issues in healthcare, in scientific advances, maybe the specialty that you see yourself in, and why that medical school in particular. Again, make sure you have questions ready for the school that you thought about, that you want to ask the school, maybe about their curriculum or services that they offer students, like counseling, maybe financial aid or scholarships, all these different considerations. Remember that you're interviewing the school just as the school's interviewing yourself, so you need to see whether you'll be a good fit for the school and that you'd like actually being there. So for MMI interviews, there are multiple mini interviews. I think it's started in McMaster University in Canada, I could be wrong. They're basically 6 to 10 minute interviews. You'll usually have several of these. These cover things like working with a standardized patient actor, an individual from a minority or another underserved community that is coming to a clinic and they're not able to get adequate access to medical services, and you need to kind of work with them through that process. It could be something where you're working with a teammate on some kind of activity, although I haven't had this that much. It could be some random activity like organizing different qualities and ranking them, writing a short essay, maybe on an art piece. Often you'll have an ethical or a scenario where, again, that University of Washington website is gold for. You usually have a few of those in an MMI rotation. There's also actually traditional style interviews in MMI rotations as well, so definitely prepare for all the traditional questions that may come up. MMIs that can actually be kind of fun since you don't really know what the situation is beforehand. You'll walk up to a door, there'll be a prompt on the door, and usually have like a bell ring or something. You'll have like a minute or so to read the prompt, and then you'll go in, you can restate the situation to the interviewer and then start answering the question. So a sample format that you can use to answer ethical questions or other complex questions is this PRYO system that I found on SDN actually. So it goes, you state the problem, you state the responsibilities to the problem, you state your opinion, and then you state the other opinion. So you want to basically summarize the situation, explain the different considerations for that, important considerations for that situation, and then explain your opinion and other opinions to show that you have a nuanced look at different complex situations as you will in medicine. So an example of this could be you're in an apartment where they have an apartment gym, you have a friend who's overweight, who's in a tough financial situation, who is trying to work out, but they don't have access to a gym and they don't want to spend money on a gym. So they're trying to ask you if they can have access to your apartment gym, but your apartment doesn't want to have other individuals who aren't part of the residents at that gym. So what would you do? So for this, you'd state the problem. You'd mention how you have a responsibility to your friend to try to help them out, a responsibility to your friend as a person who needs help. You have a responsibility to the apartment management as a resident in that apartment complex. And you'd go on to talk about your opinion and other opinions as well. So yeah, definitely make sure you look through the ethics resources that I mentioned before, the healthcare resources, stay on top of science and medical advancements, and just the news in those fields in general. I'll include a link down below again to several different MMI question banks that you can go through and prepare for maybe 100, 200 MMI style questions. So definitely go through those and be comfortable answering the different scenarios. So during the interview, I know it's going to be hard, but try to relax. Maybe meditate before you go there if you have a lot of anxiety. I've heard a psychologist say eating a healthy breakfast beforehand helps you calm down, so that might help you as well. So try to eat a good breakfast, meditate, and try to relax as much as you can. Make sure you dress professionally, so usually suit pants, a shirt, a jacket. For men, a tie. For women, I'd also recommend suit pants, maybe a suit skirt if you want. But for men and women, always try to dress conservatively and professional. You can try to dress more extravagantly once you get in for like the med school formal or something, but for the interviews, you really want to make sure you convey yourself as a future healthcare professional and this is highly, highly important. I've actually interviewed on certain days where I've seen someone come in, for example, in shorts and a shirt. So while dressing professional may seem obvious, some people might have different considerations of what they think is appropriate for medical interviews. I know it gets, when you're nervous, you get sweaty and it's a long day. Try not to wear overbearing cologne where it irritates other people, and make sure you have comfortable clothes because you're going to be walking around most of the day. Along with dressing professionally, make sure you act professionally. So one of the things with acting professionally is to make sure you arrive early. Make sure you prepare for traffic and transport delays. You don't want to be late to the interview since it's your first impression with the school, and you don't want them to have a bad impression right at the beginning. Again, make sure you bring your notepad with you and maybe some questions that you prepared for the school. Having a notepad is nice to jot down notes for either for questions that you want to ask them or different considerations that you notice while you're at the school. This should go without saying, but always be nice to everyone. I've heard of places where pre-meds come in and they aren't the nicest to like the security guard or different people in the lobby, for example, and that makes its way back to the AdCom and they have a negative impression of the interviewer because of that experience. Be honest in your interview responses. Don't try to exaggerate your achievements or experiences way too much. Make sure you're humble but at the same time confident, and do present yourself in a good light. Make sure you smile but not excessively so where you seem creepy or just like overly bubbly. Again, you want to be professional. So even in your interview, for example, if you're nervous, try to take a breath. Maybe in the beginning when you're asked a question, you can restate the question to give you a couple of extra seconds of time. You can pause if you're nervous, collect your thoughts real quick, and then keep going. But you want to make sure you try not to stumble over your words too much or have a lot of nervous tendencies like shaking around a lot or like tapping your feet or using a lot of filler words like or ahs. So regardless of if it's a traditional or an MMI style interview, make sure you convey yourself as a future physician. So you're going to have to be professional in dress and conduct. You're going to have to be respectful. You're going to have to be able to communicate well since you'll be communicating with different healthcare professionals as well as patients and maybe even the media and government officials, lobbyists, and even the general public. Interviewers want to know that you are committed to it and you are committed to helping people even with this great sacrifice that you're going to have to make. So trying to ramble on, make your answers succinct and to the point. So short and sweet is good, but try to fill up the time as much as possible if you have more to say. Some interviewers that won't ask a follow-up question, so you'll just kind of be sitting there awkwardly. So sometimes it's nice to just elaborate a little bit more on whatever points that you made or add in more points that you weren't able to fit in previously until the allotted time runs out. So after the interview, I'd recommend making thank you cards. You can make thank you cards either individually, which I think I did, taking maybe a note of the interviewer's name, or you can make a general thank you card for all your interviewers together. Some schools have different things like an electronic service where you just send thank you cards there since they don't want to handle the hundreds or thousands of thank you cards that are sent in. But most schools allow you to send in thank you cards to the school. Another thing that you can do is actually have the cards with you and quickly write them down at the end of the interview and hand them off to either the front desk or the admissions committee before you leave. So besides that, you finish the interview, make sure you go home, relax, have a celebration to celebrate finishing an important milestone in your interview process. But try not to bother schools with constant updates. Some schools might be open to updates, but usually you don't want to constantly bother them. So those are a few tips on how you can prepare yourself to do well in traditional or MMI style interviews for both osteopathic and allopathic medical schools. Let me know down below in the comments if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future videos. Thank you guys so much for watching, and good luck on your med school interviews. That's so long, dude. I don't have time to edit this.